And I know you're as anxious as I am to get into close action. But we must bring him right up beside us before we spring this trap. That will test our nerve. And discipline will count just as much as courage.
The Age of Fighting Sail. Part 9. The Persuer and the Persued. Nelson's mission to monitor and intercept the great French fleet gathering at Toulon in 1798 got off to an almost disastrous start. His 3 ships of the line, his own Vanguard, Captain Sir James Saumarez's Orion, and Captain Alexander Ball's Alexander, were east of Gibraltar, bound for Toulon, when on May 20th, a gale surprised them and dismasted the Vanguard. Under a spritsail, Nelson for 2 days clawed off a rocky shore. When the gale somewhat abated, Ball brought the Alexander alongside and took the Vanguard in tow. The 3 ships struggled towards safety in Sardinia, but heavy swells threatened to drive them ashore. At last, believing that the Vanguard was lost and that the Alexander could still escape, Nelson ordered Ball to cut loose and save himself. Ball responded that he felt confident that he could bring her in safe, and that he couldn't fathom the thought of abandoning Nelson. Ball was right. They made it to the Sardinian island off San Pietro, and Nelson was aboard the Alexander to thank his savior. If the proverb he quoted was already a cliché, the gratitude it expressed was real. A friend in need is a friend indeed. It was May 27th by the time the Vanguard had her new masts, and she and the Orion and the Alexander were now ready to go back to sea. To sea they immediately proceeded, and the following day encountered a merchantman from Marseille, whose captain they extorted the information that Toulon fleet had already set sail. Where to? Nelson could only guess. He had no fast frigates to send scouting for them. There had been frigates in his little fleet before the storm, but their commander, seeing the damage to the Vanguard as he himself was driven away, had assumed that Nelson would return to Gibraltar for major repairs and had taken the frigates there. But Nelson did not know that this had happened. Thinking that his frigates were still at sea, he headed for a prearranged general rendezvous that was some distance from Toulon, where he hoped to find his swift scouting craft to send them out reconnoitering for Napoleon. Reaching the spot, Nelson found no sign of the frigates. But the following morning he received welcome news brought to the rendezvous by Captain Thomas Hardy in the brig Mutine. St. Vincent had gotten reinforcements and had immediately sent off a frigate and 10 ships of the line to reinforce Nelson's meager squadron. Their captains were among the elite of the Royal Navy, most of them old friends of Nelson's. On June 7th they arrived. There were many greetings, and a council of war was convened, in which all agreed that they should proceed eastwardly without delay to search for the Toulon fleet. Off Naples they halted long enough to discover that the French fleet was headed for Malta. Nelson then altered his course for Malta. But off Sicily they hailed a passing ship whose master reported that the French had already captured the island. What now? Nelson polled his captains. Most believed that if the French were not at Sicily, which was obvious, Napoleon's destination was most likely Egypt at this point. And one of them even divined Napoleon's grand strategy. Wrote Thomas Trubridge, captain of the Culloden, "I am led to think Egypt is their present destination, as their getting possession of Alexandria or any part of Egypt will put our possessions in India in a very perilous situation." Off Nelson raced in hot pursuit. He had a plan. Brilliant, unconventional, and likely to bewilder the French. Instead of the usual unwavering line-ahead formation, Nelson had divided his own fleet into 3 groups. 2 groups would drive down onto Napoleon's warships from different angles, scatter them, and concentrate on a few ships at a time. The 3rd section would wade in among the transports, picking them off while their protectors were fighting for their own lives. But it was a plan never tried. The same impetuosity that made Nelson irresistible on the attack made him vulnerable in the chase. In his eagerness to find his quarry, he raced right past it. While the Toulon fleet crawled through the fog, its admiral anxiously listening to the British signal guns, the English ships sped past toward Egypt. The Persuer then preceded the Persued all the rest of the way across the Mediterranean. On June 28th, Nelson's ships backed their mainsails off Alexandria. There was no sign of the French. Nelson now wondered if he had been devastatingly wrong. Had the passing captain been mistaken or lying? Had the Toulon fleet sailed west instead of east? Was it even now on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar and headed for the English Channel? In desperation, Nelson ordered full sail back across the Mediterranean, and thereby compounded his first error. In laying his course for Alexandria, the youthful Napoleon had not relied on fog alone. He had also depended on his wits. Instead of sailing in a direct line from Malta to Alexandria, the Toulon fleet took a more roundabout course, picking up the coast of Crete before turning southeast for Egypt. After a 2-week passage, the fleet reached Alexandria on July 1st, 2 days after Nelson's departure, and Napoleon was told that a large British fleet had just left the area. Now, Bonaparte faced the problem of the landing. In a council of war held aboard the Orient, everyone agreed that it would be suicidal to attempt a landing inside Alexandria harbor. The good weather had given way to a gale coming from the north. Alexandria's defenders were waiting. Both entrances to the harbor were narrow, and the French forces would be slaughtered as they tried to enter the harbor. Admiral Brueys voted for an overnight wait for the storm to subside and a landing at nearby Aboukir Bay. However, Napoleon would not wait. He insisted they had no time to waste, and he ordered a landing on a beach at Marabut, a village 8 miles to the west of Alexandria. Through a wild night of storm and surf, with boats capsizing and smashing on the rocks, and men drowning in the surf, Napoleon's troops were landed. Without waiting for horses, artillery, food, or even water, Napoleon led his soldiers across the desert and at 8 the next morning attacked the city. By 11 a.m., Alexandria had fallen. One French officer wrote home that he felt assured that it was thirst that inspired the soldiers to capture Alexandria. Before going ashore to lead his troops, Napoleon had another disagreement with Admiral Brueys. It ended in a compromise. Napoleon wanted his fleet to anchor in Alexandria's harbor as soon as he had taken the city. Brueys wanted to return to Toulon or to the island of Corfu instead of sitting in Alexandria waiting for the British to pounce on them. He finally agreed to remain in the area, though not in Alexandria's bottlenecked harbor. Taking the fleet 23 miles east, he went into Aboukir Bay, the spot where he had wanted to land in the first place. In Brueys' opinion, Aboukir was a much more readily defensible area. The bay extended 30 miles in a long curve, ending at one of the 2 mouths of the Nile, near Rosetta. Eons of silting from the river had created a maze of channels and shoals throughout the bay, making it a trap for any ships unfamiliar with its soundings. Brueys improved on the natural defenses by mounting a battery of 4 guns and a mortar on an island inside the bay's entrance. Then he anchored his ships in a line alongside a shoaling sandbank, as close to the shelving shallow water as he dared. He ordered the upper yards of the ships brought down. At anchor there would be no need for sails, and with the spars down there would be no danger of their toppling onto the gun crews if there was any battle. Brueys' line of ships therefore made a formidable floating fortress. They were backed up close to the sandbank, with 500 guns aimed outward, ready to shatter any fleet that attempted to come in after them. Satisfied that his position was impregnable, Brueys settled down to wait for the British, if they could find him. Nelson's fleet reached Syracuse on July 19th. There was no news of the Toulon fleet. After 3 days of reprovisioning, he extended his search into Greek waters. Then, on July 28th, in the Gulf of Coroni in southern Greece, he received his first real news in a month from 2 vessels that had sighted the French fleet off the coast of Crete 4 weeks earlier, headed southeastward. The same day, Ball, in the Alexander, captured a French prize with similar information. The French fleet had in fact gone east. The British had now missed it twice. In a fury of frustration, Nelson was determined that he would not miss it again. Throughout the fruitless chase to Alexandria and back, Nelson had kept everyone ready for action at any moment. Now the tempo and the tension increased. Gun drill was held each day. The crews stood ready to clear for action. In the admiral's cabin or on the quarterdeck of the Vanguard, the conferences continued. In them every possible battle situation was proposed, and the tactics for each were discussed. These conferences were a Nelsonian innovation. The admirals of the earlier generation had kept their own counsel and orders were given by flag signals, such as they were during the battle itself. Nelson not only knew that he did not intend to fight by the book, he was also well aware that the Royal Navy's signal system was still crude and subject to misunderstandings. He intended something more, and this was his most important innovation. More than any other 18th century admiral, Nelson believed in sharing tactical options with his captains, discussing every possible situation and emphasizing that when battle was in progress, every captain would be on his own. If a captain saw an opportunity to do damage to the enemy, he was free to attack without waiting for signals from the flagship's masthead. The old line-ahead dogma of each ship blindly following the leader was not only dead, it was replaced by something previously unheard of in the Royal Navy: delegation of authority. Not surprisingly, the naval officers with whom Nelson thus shared his problems and responsibilities felt that they were something special, as indeed they were. Nelson unabashedly called them his band of brothers. With an equal lack of embarrassment, they called themselves the Chosen Band. As they sat around the Admiral's table in the Vanguard, under a ceiling dancing with sunlight reflected from the Mediterranean, they made an oddly assorted group. Sir James Saumarez of the Orion, tall and slightly supercilious, contrasted with Nelson's flag captain, Sir Edward Barry, slight, wiry, and peppery, who knew little about complicated tactics and cared even less. Barry was a fighter, pure and simple. Alexander Ball of the Alexander had a large domed forehead and the mannerisms of an Oxford Don. Ralph Miller, New York-born son of an American loyalist, had a devilish imagination. The Theseus only had 2 tiers of guns, so he painted a line of fake gun ports above the upper deck to give her the appearance of a 3-decker. The prescient Thomas Trowbridge of the Culloden was the son of a London baker and became the founder of a dynasty of admirals. Sam Hood of the Zealous was a hulking giant who could not stand upright on any of the gun decks. Thomas Foley of the Goliath was a round-faced Welshman who kept a good captain's table and enjoyed dirty stories. Bluff Ben Hallowell of the Swiftsure had once quelled a mutiny with only his fists. He was the only officer in the Royal Navy known to have given the imperious old St. Earl Vincent a resounding clap on the back. One thing tied this motley crew together. All were united in undying devotion to the soft-spoken, generous, vain, and spellbinding little one-armed genius who was seeking to lead them into battle against the Toulon fleet, if only they could find it. On the morning of August 1st, the Pharos Tower of Alexandria came into view again. But now the harbor was full of French transports, and the French flag flew from the harbor's battlements. Still there was no sign of warships. Single-mindedly, Nelson turned to search for them, setting his course along the coastline east of Alexandria. At noon, the drummers announced dinner. Nelson would not go. Anxiety kept him from eating. His captains sat down to eat in their separate dining cabins. Throughout the fleet, the stewards were pouring the last of the wine when a signal rippled to the masthead of the Zealous. Enemy discovered. Napoleon's fleet was anchored in Aboukir Bay. The hour was 2:30. Nelson studied the signal through his telescope, snapped it shut, and called for the signal, "Prepare for battle." Then he decided he would have some food after all. Below Nelson as he dined, the guns rumbled out of their carriages. On the upper decks, the stubby carronades, the devastating smashers that fired huge 68-pound cannonballs at short range, were being uncovered. From the stern windows of the Vanguard, the long line of towering ships presented an impressive parade, their clouds of sails filled by a light topsail breeze from the northwest, their round bows parting the sea in a creamy foam, their sides jagged with rows of cannon poking out. Certainly it was an impressive sight to the French Admiral Brueys as he watched from the quarterdeck of the Orient. It was now late afternoon. The Admiral had a stomachache, probably as a result of a recent attack of dysentery, but he was satisfied with the tactical position of his fleet. He expected the British to wait for him outside the bay or to set up a blockade. A ship of the line drew up 30 feet of water, so Brueys was confident that the enemy would not attempt to enter the shoal-ridden bay in the approaching darkness. He was thus utterly stunned to see the British ships approaching the bay. Nelson, characteristically, was determined to give battle, and the sooner the better. He knew that the bay was treacherous and that the French would doubtless seek to take advantage of the shoals, but he was willing to bet that a way could be found to get at the anchored enemy. And so he came, his men at the bow ready to take soundings and call back the depths of the fleet as they entered the bay. Once within range, Nelson was certain that he could destroy the French. In his cabin conferences, he had planned the tactics even for such a situation, and his captains knew exactly what to do. The fleets were evenly matched, 13 British ships of the line against 13 more heavily gunned French ships. But Nelson was upwind. If he concentrated all his ships on the enemy's van and center, the upwind ships of the French line, he could change the odds to nearly 2-1 in his favor. The downwind Frenchmen would be unable to beat upwind to join the battle. Only after knocking out the French van and center did Nelson plan to slide down the line and pick up the rest of the ships. Nelson felt remarkably chipper. He was banking on his band of brothers to do their duty. It was now 5:30 p.m. The sun had become a huge red ball touching the sand dunes to the west. The British ships approached Aboukir Island at the bay's entrance, giving it a wide berth because of the shoal reaching out toward them. The small French battery placed there by Bruys opened fire, but the range was long and the shots were ineffective. The British simply ignored them. On board the ships, the only sounds were the flutter of signal flags, the wash of water alongside, the creak of a block overhead or a gun's restraining gear below, and the soft chant of the leadsman calling the depth. On the Goliath, leading the British line, John Nichol, a Scotch cooper who had been impressed 4 years earlier, was studying the countenances of his shipmates. He later recalled not perceiving a shade of doubt nor fear. At the entrance to the bay, the Vanguard moved alongside the Zealous. Nelson called across to Hood to ask if there was enough water under their keels. Without checking, Hood replied that he felt that he did, and made the command to add on more sail. Thomas Foley of the Goliath had other ideas. One of his midshipmen had been first to sight the French fleet, but the Goliath's signal halyards had fouled, and the Zealous had raised her signal first. Foley was not going to let the Zealous beat him again. He had his studding sails and staysails ready, expecting the next command from Nelson. The moment he saw it fly to the Vanguard's yardarm, form line of battle as convenient, he let go his extra sails and forged ahead. Hood saw the Goliath move away and said to his men, "Well, never mind. Shorten sail and give him time to take up his berth. We must risk nothing that will tend to the enemy's advantage, and we shall soon have enough to do." Hood's decision to let the Goliath go first was the right one for another reason. Foley, as it happened, had the only good map of Aboukir Bay. It was in a 20-year-old French atlas titled Bellin's Collection, and it showed the soundings of the bay. With this map, Foley was able to confirm what he had already observed. Bruys had made a major miscalculation. One that would cost the French dearly, and one that the Royal Navy was ready to capitalize on.